I think that when a lot of us were growing up as kids, we had, at some point, an escapist fantasy. A lot of children's media, whenever I was growing up, played into that fantasy. The idea that all of a sudden your whole world could be turned upside down and you can go on a crazy adventure with your family. Probably the most popular example of this type of story would come from one of the most unlikely sources. Let me introduce you to my man, Robert Rodriguez. Texas native Robert Rodriguez was known before 2001 as a sort of stylized action horror filmmaker. His first ever theatrically released feature-length film, El Mariachi, would establish his reputation as the one-man film crew, as Robert Rodriguez would be known for writing, directing, shooting, editing, and composing many of his own movies. El Mariachi was filmed on an insanely low budget and actually holds the Guinness World Record for the lowest budgeted film to ever earn over $1 million at the box office. After the massive success of El Mariachi, he would go on to direct the sequel, Desperado, the fantastic horror action comedy film From Dusk Till Dawn, and the cult classic The Faculty. These subsequent releases would sort of establish Robert Rodriguez's reputation as a super stylized, gritty action horror filmmaker, with over the top being an understatement. Keeping that in mind, it's important to remember that El Mariachi, while being his first theatrically released feature-length film, was not the first project he worked on. As a matter of fact, his first major project that got him a lot of attention was a short film called Bedhead. The reason that I bring this up is that Robert Rodriguez actually has his origins in a much more child-friendly and imaginative film. This is important because after The Faculty, two major events would occur in Robert Rodriguez's life that would change his career forever. Number one being that he would have his own children. Robert Rodriguez is a family man, preferring to work on his films at night while hanging out with his kids during the day. I personally think that having kids of his own, and of course being raised in a family of 10 kids including himself, would be a deciding factor in his going a very different route for what would be his next major film. The second major event that would change Robert Rodriguez's career forever is, imagine one day Robert Rodriguez is walking on a film set. He looks over and sees this strange single-colored cloth draped from the ceiling behind two actors. Behind these two actors is just the color green. But somehow this color green is replaced by a completely different environment. Rodriguez looks to the director and says, "Sir, what is this magical device that you're showing me?" Robert Rodriguez became acquainted with the green screen, something that he would use for every single film in the rest of his career and just never, ever get good at. In 2001, Robert Rodriguez would release the biggest hit of his career, and in doing so would fulfill the dream of every single kid in the nation and would sell so many spy gadgets at the Scholastic Book Fair. This little movie, written, directed, and edited by our boy, was Spy Kids.
Spy Kids. Real spies. Only smaller.
For a lot of people, this must have been the biggest departure in a filmmaker's career probably ever. This was the exact opposite reaction to kids growing up in the 2000s like myself. Learning later in life of the other films Robert Rodriguez had made and how violent they were, Spy Kids seemed to be the normal thing that he was doing for a while. Spy Kids is just fun. Fun with a capital F. For Floop. A lot of that fun comes from the quirky setting and reality that Spy Kids takes place in. The world of Spy Kids is one that, if you couldn't tell, doesn't take itself too seriously. It's a world where spies swap guns, seduction, and espionage for gadgets, kung fu, and cartoonish disguises. In the Spy Kids universe, the main organization is the OSS. Yes, that does stand for Organization of Super Spies. If that doesn't tell you what kind of world we're in, I don't know what will. The plot primarily revolves around the two children of Gregorio and Ingrid Cortez, who are agents of the OSS that ultimately fell in love on assignment, married, and decided to retire from field work and become consultants instead. Their two children, daughter Carmen and son Junie, are raised completely sheltered from their parents' former lives. Of course, the two parents are called back into the field when Gregorio begins to suspect that the host of Junie's favorite television show, Floop's Fooglies, is abducting other OSS agents and transforming them into characters on the show. Gregorio and Ingrid are put on the case, but are quickly captured by Floop and his sidekick Minion, with Carmen and Junie being suddenly thrust into the world of super spies and having to follow in their parents' footsteps in order to rescue them from Floop. The reason Floop is abducting all of these super spies is because he is searching for something called the Third Brain, which will grant intelligence to his android Spy Kids. Wait a minute. Spy Kids. Hold on. That's the title of the movie, dude. What the Floop plans to sell the Spy Kids robots to an unnamed organization that will use them to replace the children of multiple world leaders. Without the third brain, however, the Spy Kids lack any intelligence and can't pass off as real kids. Sure enough, Gregorio ends up being one of the agents that actually worked on the third brain program, and instead of destroying it, kept it and hid it away. Junie and Carmen find the third brain, are pursued by corrupt agents of the OSS, robotic thumb people called Thumb Thumbs, and their own Spy Kid doppelgangers on their journey to rescue their parents. While the movie has a very impressive cast of adult actors including Antonio Banderas, Carla Gugino, Alan Cumming, and Tony Shalhoub, this movie really had to nail the casting of Carmen and Junie, as they are the Spy Kids. The movie falls apart without them, and luckily I think Robert Rodriguez struck gold with these two kids. Alexa Vega and Daryl Sabara do a very good job in this movie. Carmen is the older sister who's the more confident and capable of the two. Carmen also has a really long name that's kind of used as a running gag throughout the series, although if she said that name in front of an audience of white people nowadays, they would just applaud for some reason.
Carmen Elizabeth Juanita Ecosca Brava Cortez.
It's established very early on that Carmen is the one that wants the action-packed life that so many kids dream of at that age. This is why when all of the super spy stuff goes down, she's the one who takes charge and acts as though she can handle anything, sometimes to her downfall. Like most older siblings, she sees Junie as an annoyance that she's forced to look after, belittling and making fun of him for most of the movie until she gets over herself and realizes how much she loves and needs her brother by the end of the movie. Junie is imaginative, creative, and a little more innocent than Carmen. He's established to be pretty easily frightened, which Carmen sees as a weakness when they have to go on their mission together. Despite his amazement at all the spy stuff going on, Junie doesn't quite desire the adventure like Carmen does. He simply wants to go back to watching his favorite TV show and designing his own characters for the show. Even though he never dreamed of being a spy like his older sister, Junie actually ends up being very resourceful and competent, truly discovering his skills as the film goes on. This of course leads to the two of them making up, with Carmen accepting him by the end of the movie. The conflict between Junie and Carmen is actually mirrored by the relationship that their father has with his older brother Machete, of course played by the amazing Danny Trejo.
Watch out for Gregorio. Take care of Gregorio. Make sure Gregorio knows right from wrong.
But that's not what family is.
This enforces the theme of family, which is the strongest message of the film. The other biggest message of the film is staying true to who you are. This is shown through Gregorio and Ingrid desperately wanting to return to their lives as spies, Junie's desire to follow his creative passions despite his father's disapproval, and actually through who was originally thought to be the villain of the film, Floop. Floop realizes midway through the film that he doesn't really want to pursue his evil plans anymore, and that his passion truly lies in creating his TV show. It's actually his sidekick Minion who has been forcing him into the role of villain, and who ultimately betrays him when he no longer has need for him. Junie and Floop actually strike up a friendship that ends up saving the day when Junie expresses to Floop that he should be who he truly wants to be and not feel any pressure from anyone else. They're pretty simple messages, but they're effective for a kids movie. They're good messages for kids to learn the importance of family and staying true to yourself.
Oh shit. Taki mushrooms.
What truly makes Spy Kids special is the way that it's presented. The actors never take it too seriously, yet they never phone it in either. It's clear, as it is with all of Rodriguez's films, that this was a very fun movie to make. It comes across in all of the performances. The action sequences are over the top, funny, and filled with that oh so delicious Robert Rodriguez green screen. The music was instantly memorable to me going back. It has that cool, slick, action-packed spy movie feel to it. The score was actually composed by John Debney and Danny Elfman, with some contribution by Robert Rodriguez himself. And as it's been pointed out by many now, it sounds suspiciously similar to the Wonder Woman theme from a few years ago. For any kid watching the movie, as it was for me, the coolest thing about it was the gadgets. The world's smallest cameras, the jetpacks, the spy glasses, the electrocuting gum. It's like the gadgets were designed to be used by kids, but it's implied that the same gadgets get used by the adults, so it never betrays the tone. That tone, directly from Rodriguez, was intended to be a product that felt like it was written, directed, and produced by a kid, and I think it completely succeeds. It feels like it comes from the mind of a child. As a matter of fact, the Thumb Thumbs were even based on drawings done by Robert Rodriguez when he was a kid. Despite Spy Kids being intended for a younger audience, Rodriguez did not forget his root. The Fooglies, which are creatures on Floop's show, are downright terrifying. Just Just look at him! There's this weird body horror element to it, as we end up finding out that all of the Fooglies are OSS agents that have been mutated. Throughout the film, the Fooglies speak in this high-pitched, weird, jarbled nonsense that's revealed to be reversed speech, and when it's reversed, it scared the shit out of me as a kid.
Loop is a madman, help us, save us! Loop is a madman, help us, save us!
This goes back to one of my favorite things about old kids media, and I think something that's been kind of lost today. The sense of danger and consequence. Junie and Carmen do genuinely seem like they're in real danger throughout the entire movie. This adds to the story. It puts them against real odds and makes the victory all the more exciting, seeing them come over such great odds. A lot of kids' films make the mistake of being afraid to put their main characters in any real danger in fear of scaring the kids. I feel that this really just hurts a kids movie. It makes the journey less rewarding by the end of it. That's why, in a weird way, Robert Rodriguez was the perfect person to make this movie. Coming off of stylized and mature adult films gave Robert Rodriguez a clear understanding of adult storytelling that he could translate into a kids film. This movie is for kids, feels like it was made by kids, yet it never talks down to kids. And I think that's the biggest achievement when I went back to watch Spy Kids. Yeah, the effects are just about as dated as the spy tech in the movie, and the plot isn't exactly anything groundbreaking, but it captures that imagination of childhood perfectly. The excitement of your entire life being suddenly changed into an action movie that you get to live out with your entire family. I love Spy Kids, and I think everybody else did too. Spy Kids grossed over $150 million at the box office, becoming the biggest hit of Robert Rodriguez's career at that time. It's still remembered fondly to this day by all the kids that saw it, and are now probably showing it to their own kids, which makes me feel old. With the biggest success of his career now under his belt, it only made sense that Robert Rodriguez would consider doing a sequel. And like most good sequels, he went bigger and, in my opinion, better with Spy Kids 2: Island of Lost Dreams. That's right, we're doing all three.
Spy Kids 2: The Island of Lost Dreams.
Just 1 year later, in the year 2002, Spy Kids 2: Island of Lost Dreams was released. And you just have to appreciate that right off the bat, Robert Rodriguez just decided to let stuff get wacky. Spy Kids 2 benefits, like all good sequels do, from not having to establish the world and the characters. Remember when I mentioned earlier that Spy Kids doesn't take itself too seriously? Yeah, this is still very true, and even more so in Spy Kids 2. While the first movie spent some time in the normal world right at the beginning, Spy Kids 2 immediately abandons anything normal and fully, beautifully embraces the cartoony moments that made the first film so fun. I just miss the era when movies used to do stuff like this. Spy Kids 2 isn't afraid to go over the top or ridiculous. Yet, at the same time, it still stays true to the characters and the world established in the first movie, expanding and growing them with its bonkers story. After the events of the first film, the OSS has a brand new Spy Kids division, and Junie and Carmen are the best of the best. Or at least they're trying to stay that way as two new rival agents are introduced, Gary and Gertie Giggles. Gary and Junie specifically despise one another, while Carmen has a bit of a crush on Gary. Gary and Gertie kind of start the movie off stealing the thunder of Junie and Carmen. Gary and Gertie's father, Donegan Giggles, who was introduced in the first film as one of the kidnapped agents, is promoted to the director of the OSS, which is a position that Gregorio was supposed to get. So the Cortezes are dealing with quite a bit when this movie starts. Things get even worse when, during an OSS awards banquet, something called the Transmuker device is stolen off the President of the United States by a bunch of men wearing magnet helmets, who escape after fighting off a ton of Spy Kids. Junie, thanks to Gary, takes the blame for the loss of the device and is fired from the OSS. Donegan sends Gary and Gertie after the Transmuker device, but Carmen helps Judy get reinstated, and they steal the assignment off of the Giggleses. This causes our heroes to end up on a mysterious island where none of their electronic gadgets can function. After learning that their kids have disappeared, Gregorio and Ingrid go to rescue their kids with the unexpected help of Ingrid's parents, Valentine and Helga. What follows is a race between the Cortezes and the Giggleses to get the Transmuker device, all while avoiding the crazy hybrid animals on the island created by the mysterious Island Man. All the characters from the first film return, even Floop and Minion having a short appearance. Junie and Carmen are now much more confident and capable spies than they were in the first film. They don't bicker and argue as much as they did in the first film either, so it's nice to see them acknowledge one another's strengths and actually work together as a team. Again, it gives these two actors opportunities to shine. They work off of each other insanely well, and that chemistry chemistry established in the first film is still present here. Each and every character in this movie has their own little sort of arc they go through. The most important conflict in the film is the rivalry between Junie and Carmen and Gary and Gertie. Gary Giggles, played by Matt O'Leary, is your typical bad boy show-off character. He does everything for personal gain and glory from both the public and from his father. Junie can't stand Gary, but Carmen has a big crush on Gary, causing her to actually take his side over Junie at some points. At one point, she literally says, "I can change him." I'm not kidding. Gary's younger sister Gertie, while being a little bit of a show-off herself, is nowhere near as bad as her brother, and even develops a friendship with Carmen as the film goes on. She's the one that truly opens Carmen's eyes to Gary's terrible behavior, and ultimately ends up siding with the Cortezes against her father and brother by the end of the film. The strong message of family unity is still present here from the first movie, but it's also mixed with this new theme of choosing the right thing over your family. This is where Gertie succeeds, where Gary fails, as it's revealed that Donegan Giggles is the man behind everything, wanting to use the transmooker device to take over the world. Gary isn't entirely evil, however. He does show some regret for his actions and genuinely does have feelings for Carmen. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Gertie Giggles is portrayed by Emily Osment, who only a few years later would go on to portray Lily in the Hannah Montana series for Disney. Spy Kids 2 really ups the first one in the casting department. A few great character actors are added into the mix, including Carmen and Junie's grandparents, who are played by Holland Taylor and the late great Ricardo Montalban. Of course, the in-laws feud with Gregorio throughout the film over how they're going to rescue the kids, but by the end they admit their respect and approval for him. Of course, Grandpa would get a much bigger role in the next Spy Kids movie. Speaking of character actors, Steve Buscemi appears playing Romero, a scientist who created monsters that roam the island, as well as the transmooker device to keep the island hidden away so he could conduct his experiments. Romero's main conflict of the film is that despite creating the creatures, he fears them and won't leave his home to go out and confront them. Similar to Floop in the first film, thanks to Junie, Romero eventually overcomes his fear and makes peace with what he's created. And yes, the greatest line ever written in the history of cinema appears in this movie and is spoken by Steve Buscemi.
Do you think God stays in heaven because he too lives in fear of what he's created?
Danny Trejo and Cheech Marin return as Carmen and Junie's real Uncle Machete and their fake Uncle Felix. Christopher McDonald, who's probably best known for Shooter McGavin from Happy Gilmore, but will always be Kent Mansley in my heart, portrays the President of the United States in this film. The President's daughter, Alexandra, is set up as a romantic interest for Junie, who helps her to connect with her busy and absent father by the end of the movie. Alexandra is actually played by Taylor Momsen, who we all know as Cindy Lou Who in Ron Howard's version of The Grinch. Currently, she's the lead singer of the rock band The Pretty Reckless. Alexandra putting herself in danger to get her father's attention is actually how we open the entire movie, in a scene that takes place at a theme park run by a character named Dinky Winks. Oh, I love these movies. The Dinkster here is, of course, played by the late, great Bill Paxton, who just chews up the scenery like he did in everything he was in. As I mentioned before, Donegan returns from the first film in a much bigger role as the main antagonist, and is portrayed by Mike Judge. Mike Judge is best known as the creator and main voice actor of Beavis and Butthead, and as a certain gentleman that sells propane and propane accessories. The story of Spy Kids 2 ups the size and scale, giving us bigger locations to explore, and while I do joke about the green screen work, there are some really beautiful locations on display here where they actually filmed. The island is treacherous at every turn, and while the gadgets of the Spy Kids movies are the most fun part for me, with the island completely wiping out all technology, it lets us see how resourceful Carmen and Junie actually are without them. It truly is what separates them from Gary and Gertie. Some of the jokes from the first movie are reincorporated into the second film. They redo the gag of Carmen's long name, but we actually get to hear Junie's full name as well.
Junie Rocket Racer Rebel Cortez.
Fun fact, Rocket Racer and Rebel are the names of Robert Rodriguez's actual kids. They even bring back the shiitake mushrooms gag again.
You're so full of shit, talking mushrooms.
There are moments where Spy Kids 2 genuinely feels like a live-action cartoon, and I am here for it. Getting to see actual toddlers beat up bad guys and work for the OSS, the dudes with the magnet helmets, and some Sam Raimi-level goofy close-ups, Spy Kids 2 doesn't care about realism or being grounded in any kind of way. It's a movie made for you to have a good time. While Spy Kids 1 had some homages to movies in the spy genre, Spy Kids 2 has a more classic adventure cinema influence. There's some Indiana Jones exploring and some swashbuckling elements, elements and the hybrid animals that the kids encounter are heavily influenced by the classic stop-motion artist Ray Harryhausen. I think they're lovingly designed, if not perfectly rendered. One of the coolest moments of the movie for me as a kid was the influence of the sword-wielding skeletons. This is directly lifted from Ray Harryhausen's 1963 classic, Jason and the Argonauts. The CG is pretty wonky and the glorious green screen returns here, but I think the reason I'm more forgiving of effects like this over something more modern is that, again, the movie isn't trying to convince you that any of this is real. It's just trying to entertain you, and the visuals match the goofy tone perfectly. One of the few elements that I do feel is a little bit weaker in Spy Kids 2 compared to the first movie is some of the darker elements are not present here. Despite the fact that there are giant monsters and rival agents, Junie and Carmen never really feel like they're as in danger in this movie as they were in the first one. I think this is both due to a combination of the goofy visuals and Carmen and Junie being a little bit more capable and less out of their depth than the first movie. Speaking of being more capable, there are some genuinely really good stunts pulled off by the actual actors in this movie. Getting these kids to pull off stunts is something that Robert Rodriguez is still doing today. Kind of like Floop and Minion in the first film, Gary and Donegan are punished for their actions, but it's more done in a slap-on-the-wrist fashion. No characters die or anything extreme like that in any of these movies, and the idea of being somewhat forgiven and expected to do better is carried over into the next movie. There's this idea that Junie is actually mistreated by the OSS early on, and after being confronted by Gary over what it means to truly be a spy, as in having to not trust anyone and put aside personal attachments, Junie actually decides to leave the OSS by the end of the movie. Again, setting things up for more of a sequel than the first one did. So, why do I like Spy Kids 2 more than the first? I think it ultimately comes down to the creative freedom that one gets with a sequel. We don't have to spend our time introducing this world, and we just get to experience more of it. We know these characters, and we get to see them grow and evolve as well as play off of one another again. The new characters are a ton of fun and played hilariously by some great character actors, and I just love the callbacks to older adventure and monster movies. The island setting is just much more cool to me than Floop's castle. Dude, there's even an early 2000s song and dance sequence during the credits. How can you not love Spy Kids 2? The answer is, you can't not love Spy Kids 2. Everybody loves Spy Kids 2. It was a huge hit, just like the first movie. And old Robbie Rodriguez decided to continue his quest to go bigger and better in Spy Kids 3. And while he did go bigger in terms of ambition, I think he missed the better part, unfortunately, with the next movie. But I can't talk about Spy Kids 3 without your help at home. I need you to get your red and blue cardboard 3D glasses and put them on now. We're going to enter the world of the game.
Spy Kids 3D Game Over. Coming soon to 3DVD with your own set of 3D glasses.
In 2003, Spy Kids 3D Game Over was released into theaters to a collective outcry of, what in the hell am I looking at? If the first two Spy Kids movies were Robert Rodriguez's little romantic fling with the green screen, Spy Kids 3 was a full-on marriage. Over 90% of Spy Kids 3 was filmed on a green screen, and I think it's pretty easy to tell. Not only did the green screen look like absolute butt, it was also released at the resurgence of this magical technology called 3D, which means not only did you have to look at whatever the hell all of this is, but you had to look at it through cheap cardboard glasses with red and blue lenses on them. Needless to say, the first thing that stands out about this movie is the subpar visuals. But no matter how dated film effects can get over the years, I do genuinely believe that a good story can make up for it. The first two movies had pretty fun stories, but unfortunately, the finale of our little trilogy here is lacking compared to its predecessors. So, Junie has retired from the OSS and now works as a private detective, despite everyone wanting him to rejoin the OSS as an agent. Like most kids, Junie is excited for the newest hit video game coming out called Game Over, made by a mysterious developer known only as the Toymaker. It turns out that the Toymaker used to work for the OSS and was actually imprisoned in cyberspace, where he developed the game with the intention to take over the minds of all the children who play it. Junie is contacted by the former head of the OSS and now US president, who I forgot to mention in the first two movies is played by George Clooney, who tells him that Carmen is imprisoned in the game after going in alone to stop the Toymaker. Junie is sent into the game to rescue his sister sister and shut the game down. Along the way, he meets a cast of characters who agree to join him only because they believe he's the guy who appears on the cover of the game. He's also joined by his grandfather, once again played by Ricardo Montalban, who has his own personal vendetta against the Toymaker. The main issue that I have with this story is that they split Carmen and Junie up. The Spy Kids hardly interact in this movie. Carmen is barely in this movie. She's shown to be unconscious for most of it, and she only really physically shows up when there's about 20 minutes left. This leaves only Junie, Grandpa, and the other characters to carry the movie, and while I still love Daryl Sabara, Junie is just super whiny in this movie, and doesn't have the same charisma that he had in the first two without Alexa Vega to play off of. The new characters are all very boring to me. Their characters are entirely diluted down to just cool, tough, and smart. I'm not kidding, this is literally how they choose to identify themselves. I know this is a movie for kids, but the characters in the first two were given enough moments to show their resourcefulness as well as their flaws. Here, the side characters are mostly total jerks to Junie for most of it until they come to think he's the guy, which opens up another problem with the movie. It would be cool if Junie led the way through the entire movie showing off how skilled he was, so that when the real guy does eventually appear, the other characters realize that they all have potential and don't have to be destined to or whatever. This is actually where I thought it was gonna go, but no. Junie is embarrassingly nerfed in this movie. There are no moments in the story where he overcomes any obstacles on his own. Whether it's his grandpa, Carmen, or this girl who we'll talk about later, Junie is always getting his ass saved from near death throughout the entire movie by other characters. And funny enough, he doesn't even save Carmen. She's let go by the Toymaker. I mentioned this girl before, Demetra, who at first seems to like Junie and joins the team where she dies to, of course, save Junie. It's revealed later that Demetra is actually a programmed part of the game that's meant to deceive the players, but she still helps them anyway. She never really leads them astray within the entire, 10 minutes she's with the group, and still ultimately likes Junie at the end, sacrificing herself to shut down the game. And Junie's reaction to her game over made me overthink the plot of this movie a little bit too much. So, how does this game work? Junie and Carmen seem to be able to touch and feel everything they interact with in this world like it feels real, like it's a virtual reality thing. So you would assume that it's like The Matrix, where they're jacked into the world through some mind device or something. But apparently all you need is just a pair of glasses. But before Junie enters the game, they show a kid wearing the glasses and playing with a controller. Does it all feel real to him? How are the other kids playing? How are the 3 other kids playing the game? And also, the point of the Toymaker is to enslave the minds of all the children in the world, but if you die in the game, you don't die for real in the real world. So what's stopping the parents from just taking the glasses off their kids and taking their controllers away and shutting off their consoles? I know I'm overanalyzing it here, and there are definitely some weird moments in the first 2 movies, but the logical issues are more present here because the world contradicts itself. Also, even funnier, Junie decides to bring in his paraplegic grandfather into the game world, all with no guarantee that he'll be able to walk again here. After he selects him, his grandpa immediately shows up and acts like he has no idea where the hell he is or why he's there. How did he get there? When they leave the game, he's shown taking off the glasses, so clearly he had to have been picked up by the OSS. Did they just not tell him what he was going there for? Imagine just being an old man chilling at your house in your wheelchair and a bunch of OSS agents show up and grab you, take you somewhere, put VR goggles on you, and don't tell you why. Of course, when Grandpa does arrive in the game, he's given an upgrade that lets him walk again and gives him this cool robot outfit. It's just so clear that they took Ricardo Montalban, put him in a chair in front of a green screen, cut his head out, and put it on a CG body, because there are so many parts where it just doesn't match the CG body. I love it. It's great. I love it. I love it so much. The Toymaker is played by Sylvester Stallone, who won a Golden Raspberry for Worst Supporting Actor for his performance. And I love Sylvester Stallone, but yeah, it's kind of awkward. The Toymaker and the grandfather have a history that's revealed after the grandpa shuts down the game and releases the Toymaker into the real world. Now, for as much as I've been whining about this movie, the final act is where it picks up. I remember being so hype as a kid with the final act of this movie. Avengers Endgame, get that shit out of here! The Toymaker sends giant robots to downtown Austin for some reason, and Junie and Carmen call in every single supporting character from the first 2 movies in to help them defeat the robots. Dude, we're talking the parents, Machete, Floop, Minion, Gary and Gertie Giggles, Grandma and Grandpa, Romero, and Dicky Winks.
Somebody ring the dingster!
the clip whenever Dinky Winks flies down with the umbrella. Go to the YouTube channel Dinkster Daily. He uploads that clip every day. It's fantastic. I love that they have text that shows up at the bottom of the screen telling you who each character is, just in case you forgot. If this final finale sequence is any indication, Spy Kids 3 is not without its charm or fun moments. While the world of the game is pretty ugly and unappealing to look at, the action sequences are very fun. Surfing on lava, this crazy death race throwback, this sort of lightsaber fight that they have, it's all a ton of fun, and this is where it actually begins to feel like the first two Spy Kids movies. Also, I know this is kind of off topic here, but I just have to mention the part when the real guy shows up. He's played by Elijah Wood, who looks nothing like the silhouette of the character on the cover, but whatever. He walks in and he gives this rousing speech to the kids like they're gonna win the day and he's gonna lead them to victory. He walks through the door into the final level of the game, says, "Cake," and then fucking dies immediately. In addition to the Fast and Furious level obsession with family that Spy Kids has always had, Spy Kids 3 seems to introduce the theme of forgiveness into the mix. The first hint is with Donegan, the main villain from the last movie, who's rejoined the OSS with the help of his wife, played by Salma Hayek. Gary Giggle shows up at the end of the movie to help fight the robots, along with even Minion. This theme comes full circle with the grandfather forgiving the Toymaker for wronging him in the past, leading to the Toymaker to be completely redeemed by the end of the movie. Spy Kids 3D Game Over is a bonkers movie that I still highly recommend for a good time. It's not as good as the first two, but it does ultimately make up in feeling like this finale to the series. This weird trilogy has a kind of strange place in pop culture history, being both a staple of children's movies and a stylistic change-up for one of my personal favorite filmmakers. Not everything Robert Rodriguez makes is gold, but he's established himself as a very unique and diverse voice in the cinematic landscape. It's amazing to think that Shark Boy and Lava Girl came out the same year as one of my favorite movies of all time, Sin City. Like Spy Kids 3, Sin City was filmed almost entirely on green screen, and the improvement in technique here is just jaw-dropping. The images speak for themselves. It perfectly balances that goofy comic book tone like his children's films with the gritty, over-the-top violence of his earlier works. Sin City is a masterpiece adaptation of Frank Miller's original graphic novels. It's just really cool to get to see the trajectory of a filmmaker's career while they're figuring out their craft and getting better and better. And while most filmmakers who get to work on heavier projects like the El Mariachi trilogy, Sin City, and eventually getting to head their own Star Wars project would forget their roots, Rodriguez is still making stuff for his kids. And regardless of what you think of the quality of these projects, Rodriguez is still making the movies he wants to make and doesn't compromise his vision in any way. So that's it. That's my fun little trip down memory lane through the Spy Kids trilogy. The Spy Kids trilogy. It's a trilogy. There was not another one. It doesn't exist. If you've actually sat through this whole thing, man, thank you for doing that. I really appreciate it. I know this video was long and kind of all over the place, but I appreciate you watching. If you haven't done so, please subscribe if you like what I do and you want to see more. Thank you again. I really appreciate it. See you next time.